you're here, it's because you can't sleep. Perhaps you're looking for a solution, a way out. But there's no peace here. Only stories. Stories that draw you in, that follow you, even in your dreams. Can you hear that silence? This is no ordinary silence. It's the silence that shadows respect before they manifest themselves. Listen carefully. Every creak in the night could be more than just a noise. Just like that whisper you thought you heard just behind you. I'm going to tell you some stories. Stories that few dare to listen to. But before you dive in, remember, these stories once heard will never leave you. They will creep into your thoughts, into your nightmares, until sleep is but a distant memory. Are you ready to listen? Because once I start, there's no turning back. Father Gabriel stood before the altar, a cold sweat running down his forehead. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the silver crucifix to his chest. The church was plunged into icy darkness, the empty pews seeming to watch silently. The candles on the altar flickered, their golden glow struggling to fend off the darkness that invaded the nave. That evening, Gabriel was going to attempt the unthinkable, an ancient ritual forgotten for centuries, a ritual that even the church considered heresy. But he had no choice. Anna, a young girl from the village, was doomed. It was no longer just a matter of life and death. It was a matter of the soul. Her parents had taken her to church one last time after trying everything. The doctors had given up. The usual prayers had had no effect. But Gabriel knew. He knew it was something much darker. Something that couldn't be cured with simple blessings. Anna was possessed. The ritual of last hope. A ceremony so dangerous that it could just as easily save the child's soul as condemn that of the priest performing it. Gabriel had sworn never to touch this book. The Liber Demonum. Hidden in the church basement and covered in rusty chains was a cursed grimoire. A compendium of occult rites and forbidden curses. Opening its pages meant verging on the abyss. But the desperate look in Anna's mother's eyes had convinced him to attempt the irreparable. That evening, he went down into the crypt beneath the church. The air was cold and heavy, almost suffocating. The grimoire lay there, in the center of a room where time seemed to stand still. Gabriel hesitantly unlocked the chains. No sooner had he opened the book than a chill breeze swept through the room, instantly extinguishing all the candles. But there was no turning back. The incantation. He had to say the exact incantation in ancient Latin. He knew that a single mistake could condemn his soul forever. When he returned to the nave, Anna was already there, lying on the altar like a sacrificial lamb. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale, drawn, almost translucent. She hadn't breathed for several hours, but Gabriel sensed that something was still inside her. He took a deep breath, recited the first words, and the silence in the church became deafening. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and lengthen as if they were coming to life, watching every word that came out of the priest's mouth. The temperature dropped sharply, and Gabriel's voice cracked in the frozen air. Then a hoarse, otherworldly voice echoed through the church. "You dare to invoke that which must not be named, Gabriel." The priest froze. That voice wasn't coming from Anna. It seemed to echo all around him as if the whole church was speaking. Yet he continued to recite, each word catching in his throat. One by one, The candle flames were extinguished and the nave plunged into an oppressive darkness. Gabriel felt like a mouse in a trap, watched over by a presence that was crushing him with its malevolence. "You can't chase me away, Gabriel," whispered the voice. "This soul has been mine since the day it was born. You're just a poor man, a puppet in my hands." Anna's body began to convulse, her back arching to an impossible angle as incomprehensible murmurs came from her mouth. Her face, pale and bruised, turned towards Gabriel, her eyes now completely black. The priest struggled not to look away. He finally finished the incantation with an exhausted breath. There was a deathly silence. Nothing happened. Anna remained inert, frozen in a grotesque position. With bated breath, Gabriel approached, hoping it wasn't too late. But before he could lay a hand on her, an inhuman howl ripped through the air. A black, formless shape sprang from Anna's body, throwing Gabriel back against the altar. The shadow grew and twisted, taking on a grotesque, deformed appearance. "You called me, Gabriel, and now you're going to follow me." Gabriel tried to get up, but the pain in his ribs was unbearable. The shadow approached slowly, relentlessly. Each step echoed through the church like the death knell of a fatal judgment. Gabriel tried to say a prayer, but the words were stuck in his throat. His crucifix, once so powerful, now seemed as fragile as paper between his fingers. The shadow enveloped the priest and silence fell. Gabriel no longer had the strength to scream. All that remained was the darkness and the murmur of an evil laugh. The ritual of last hope had failed. Anna's soul may have been saved, but Gabriel's was lost forever. And in the darkness of the church, a final whisper was heard. "Another will come." The rain pounded against the roof of the church, each drop echoing like a doom in the empty nave. Inside, the air was icy cold, charged with a tension that not even prayer could soothe. Father Lucian stood by the altar, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the little chapel. He knew what awaited him this evening. For weeks, things had taken a terrible turn, beyond all logic and faith. In a dark room at the back of the church lay Pierre, an 8-year-old boy, chained to an iron bed. His mother had begged the church to intervene after consulting all the doctors, but none of them had found a rational explanation for his condition. It was no longer an ordinary child who lay there, but something that wore his face, a being possessed by a force far more ancient and malevolent than anything Lucian had ever faced. The priest was no longer young, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of the years and the spiritual battles he had fought. Yet tonight, he felt older than ever. Exorcisms were a thing of the past for him. His superiors had warned him that this would be his final battle. He had already warded off several infernal creatures in his career, but this time a dull fear was gnawing at his insides. Father Etienne, his young assistant, was waiting outside the room. He had never witnessed an exorcism before, and Lucian could see the terror in his eyes. They exchanged a brief glance before Lucian slowly pushed open the door to the room, revealing the bound child. Pierre's body lay in eerie silence, but his face was marked by ghastly contortions, twisted smiles and unhealthy grimaces that seemed to belong to no child. Her eyes, once bright and innocent, were now two black abysses devoid of all light. Lucian felt an icy chill run through him. "Let's begin," he murmured, taking out the ritual from the Book of Exorcisms. No sooner had he opened his mouth to begin the prayers than the boy began to tremble violently, his arms twisting at impossible angles despite the chains that restrained him. A guttural voice from the depths of nothingness escaped the boy's lips, a voice that was not his own. "Do you really think you can drive me away, old man? You're weak. So weak." Lucian tried not to answer, knowing that any attempt at direct communication would only aggravate the situation. He continued his prayers, but every word he spoke seemed to evaporate into the cold air as if they had no weight against the entity. "You have no idea what I am, priest," the voice hissed again. "It's not this child you're trying to save. It's you." Lucian stiffened. How could he know? How could that thing know the doubts that had been gnawing at his mind for months? Ever since his last exorcism, something had followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He had confessed and prayed for hours, but the weight of it remained constant and oppressive. The child twisted further, his back arching inhumanly, his mouth opening in a terrifying sneer. "You never left that church, Lucian. All this time you thought you were fighting us, but it's you who's trapped. Take a good look, priest. See who's really possessed." Lucian's hands shook even more as his mind wavered. He stared at the child, but for the first time he had the strange impression that it wasn't Pierre tied to the bed. That face, those eyes. It wasn't a demon in front of him, but something even more terrifying. It was himself. Lucian took a step back in horror. The outlines of the room seemed to dissolve into a black mist, and the figure of Peter faded into a distorted version of the priest, chained shouting words of prayer in a suffocating silence. "You're the one who's been captured, Lucian," whispered the voice. "You failed a long time ago, and now you're condemned to stay here. This church is nothing but a prison for you, and for anyone else who ventures here." Lucian blinked, shaking his head to get rid of the illusion, but the terror grew inside him. Every prayer he whispered seemed to turn against him, to be extinguished before it reached the heavens. The air grew heavier, and a shadow approached him, brushing against him like an icy caress. Father Anthony stood in the doorway, watching the scene in silence, his face frozen in horror. He tried to move forward to help Lucian, but his legs refused to move. The aging priest fell to his knees, the Book of Exorcisms slipping from his hands. His lips whispered one last desperate prayer, but the evil laughter that echoed through the room answered him before he could finish it. "It's you, Lucian. You've been possessed all along." Night engulfed the room, and the last thing young Father Etienne heard was his mentor's heart-rending cry, echoing through the church like an eternal sentence. Father Julian was finishing his evening prayer, kneeling before the altar, when the heavy doors of the small church opened with a shrill creak. The icy night wind rushed into the nave, sweeping away the few candles still lit and plunging the place into an oppressive darkness. Julian shivered and sat up slowly. At this late hour, the church doors were still closed, yet someone had just entered. "Father, may I confess?" The voice that echoed in the half-light was soft, almost whispered, but it carried a strange resonance that made the priest shiver. A figure stood at the entrance to the confessional, barely visible beneath a black veil. It waited, motionless. Julian, despite the sudden hesitation, signed quickly and walked towards the small, dark wooden box. "Of course, my child," he replied, his trembling voice betraying an anxiety he did not yet understand. The woman walked silently into the confessional. Julian took his place on the other side of the grill in total darkness. He could only guess at her presence on the other side, but the air had become so heavy that it almost seemed as if the room was breathing around him. "Tell me, what sins torment you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. There was a long silence, so heavy that Julian began to doubt whether the woman was really there. Then, finally, she spoke. "Father, I've done terrible things. Things you can't imagine." Her voice was different now, lower, almost guttural, as if it came from a throat incapable of pronouncing human words. Julian tensed, his fingers tightening around the cross around his neck. "My child, there is no sin that cannot be forgiven as long as you sincerely repent of it," he replied in a more confident voice. "Ah, but Father," she murmured icily, "what I've done is not what you call a sin. It's much worse." Julian felt a coldness invade the small cabin. His breathing became shorter, every word the woman said seeming to suck the air out of his lungs. "Tell me what you did." The silence that followed was so intense that Julian could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. And then she began to speak. She described things that were beyond comprehension, rituals, sacrifices, unholy acts committed in the shadows of forgotten places, invocations that even the demons themselves would have feared. The more she spoke, the stranger and more inhuman her voice became, as if she were no longer a simple woman on the other side, but something ancient, something malevolent, using her body to express itself. Julian felt the fear welling up inside him, taking him over completely. He tried to pray inwardly, to recall psalms to find some comfort, but no sacred words seemed to reach his mind, as if they had all been erased. He tried to interrupt her, to guide her towards redemption, but every time he opened his mouth, his throat tightened as if an invisible force prevented him from speaking. "My father," she continued, her tone lower, closer, as if she were leaning against the grate. "Father, I didn't just sin. I left this world a long time ago." Julian felt an icy terror seize him. What she had just said, he understood now. He understood why he couldn't feel her presence, why the air seemed so heavy. It wasn't a woman of flesh and blood who was confessing, but a lost soul, a damned soul, a soul that wasn't looking for redemption, but for something else. "Father Julian," she whispered mockingly, "do you remember me?" Her insides froze. How could she know his name? He had never seen this woman before. He tried to get up, to leave the confessional, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if he were paralyzed. "I was there, Father. 20 years ago. Don't you remember? You left me to die in that church. You refused to help me." The memories came rushing back to Julian. That night, so long ago, a woman had come, begging for help. She was plagued by an illness he didn't understand, something supernatural. He'd been afraid and sent her away, refusing to believe her stories about a curse. She died a few days later alone, in an icy alley. "No," murmured Julian, horrified. "No, this can't be." The shadow's voice burst into an icy laugh, ripping through the air like invisible claws. The remaining candles in the church were extinguished, plunging the place into total darkness. Julian tried one last time to pray, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by indescribable terror. "So you fled, Father. But this time, you can't escape what's coming for you." And just as the whole church seemed to fade away, swallowed up by the shadows, Julian's last cry was lost in the void. The bells of the village of Saint-Aignan were never to ring after nightfall. It was an immutable rule, handed down from generation to generation, engraved in the history of this small, isolated village. A rule that no one had ever dared to break, until that evening. In the darkness, an oppressive silence reigned over the village, broken only by the occasional creak of branches in the night wind. The inhabitants had shut themselves away in their houses, carefully locking doors and windows. They all knew the story. They knew why they shouldn't defy the cursed chimes of the old church. It was a moonless night when the fateful sound resounded for the first time in over a century. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3. The bells, once silent, vibrated in the night air, awakening echoes that the village had hoped to forget forever. Inside the church, old Auguste, the sacristan, sat up suddenly, frozen with fear. He had never seen or heard anyone touch the bells after sunset. His hand trembled as he grabbed an oil lamp, barely illuminating the nave. Each step sounded heavy, amplified by the icy solitude of the church. The heaviness in the air was palpable, as if something sinister were lurking just out of sight. He knew what the sound of the bells meant. The story of the damned. Lost souls condemned to wander, bound to this village by a dark pact. Souls who were never to be awoken. Auguste gritted his teeth. He had to find out who had dared to desecrate this sacred place, who had dared to awaken the darkness. Another bell rang. The sound echoed through his whole body, chilling him to the marrow. He climbed the steps leading to the tower with growing apprehension. Every step brought him closer to something terrible. He could feel it. A shiver ran down his spine. But he carried on, despite the heavy weight on his chest. When he finally reached the tower, he found no one there. The bells were swinging gently as if moved by an invisible force. The sacristan took a step back, terrified. No human being had rung those bells, that was obvious. A dull thump sounded behind him. He turned abruptly, and there, in the darkness of the tower, he saw shadows writhing. Human silhouettes, but distorted, blurred, as if they belonged to another world. They moved slowly, silently, their bodies seeming to dissolve in the air with each step. Their faces, Auguste couldn't tell if they were human. Their eyes, empty and black, reflected nothing but the abyss that inhabited them. The damned had returned. In a state of panic, Auguste ran down the stairs as fast as his shaky legs would carry him, but with every step he felt their presence getting closer, trapping him in a suffocating terror. The shadows seemed to slip behind him, their putrid breath filling the air. When he finally reached the nave, the church doors creaked open. Outside, the streets were deserted, but the damned didn't stop at the edge of the church. They spread out, their slow but inexorable march spreading throughout the village. The inhabitants, who had heard the bells, were now trapped in their homes. Auguste could see terrified figures behind closed windows, trembling hands pulling back curtains in the hope that the damned would pass without seeing them. But he knew that this would not protect them, for the chimes never stopped. Once awake, the damned would hunt down those who dared to hear their call. An old legend said that the only way to appease lost souls was to refuse to pay them any attention, to ignore them completely, not to react to their presence. But seeing the damned approaching the houses, hearing the muffled cries of those holed up inside, Augustus knew that this night the legend would not be enough. They were looking for something more. The shadows stretched out, slithering under the doors and through the walls like snakes of black mist. The first screams tore through the night, freezing Augustus's blood. A scream of agony, a scream of pure terror, as if the damned were devouring the souls of those who crossed them. He ran towards the village, but where could he go? He knew it. He felt it. This night, no one would escape their wrath. The bells had rung. They would not be silenced until daybreak, and by then, Saint Agnan would be nothing more than a graveyard of empty bodies, haunted by the echoes of lost souls. Auguste stopped in the center of the village, his desperate gaze turned towards the tower, where the bells continued to ring merciless and implacable. And in the midst of this infernal ringing, he heard a distant voice, a voice whispered from another world. "We're here for you, Auguste. We've been waiting for you for so long." Before he could react, the shadows engulfed him. Silence fell over Saint-Agnan, with only the bells of the damned still ringing in the wind. A legend circulated among the few pilgrims who still ventured to the ruins of St. Victor's Abbey, a forgotten place at the bottom of a remote valley. It was rumored that an ancient brotherhood of monks had once watched over a secret so terrible that it was best left forgotten. For centuries, the place had been nothing but ruins and rubble, but the more reckless claimed that the earth there still bore the traces of something profoundly evil, a warning and a threat. When Pierre arrived at Saint-Victor, night had already fallen. The imposing silhouette of the ruins stood out against the darkness, seemingly watching anyone who dared approach. He had come to find out what was hidden in this place. His work as an archaeologist had led him to many strange discoveries, but nothing had ever fascinated him as much as the stories surrounding this abbey. The Watchers, as they were known, were monks who, according to legend, had been cursed to protect a door to a cataclysm, a door sealed beneath the abbey, hidden under tons of stone and earth, but which no one had ever found. But tonight, Pierre was here to find out whether this story was just a myth or a terrible forgotten truth. As he walked through the main courtyard, his footsteps echoed strangely, as if the air itself were absorbing the sounds. Every stone seemed imbued with something sinister, as if the centuries had not erased the echoes of a terrifying past. The night breeze blew through the broken arches, carrying with it distant, almost imperceptible whispers. Pierre felt an icy chill run through him. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else here, something watching him. He took out his torch and pointed the beam towards the shifting shadows of the ruins. His heart raced as he saw indistinct, blurred shapes like silhouettes moving between the collapsed columns. Yet when he stepped forward, there was nothing there. Legend spoke of cursed monks condemned to eternal vigil. Pierre shook his head, trying to banish the irrational thoughts. It was absurd. But the further he went into the abbey, the more the feeling of being spied on intensified. In an adjacent room, he found an opening hidden under some rubble. His research had led him here. Beneath this abbey might lie a crypt, a place forgotten for centuries. With his heart pounding, he slipped through the opening and down a series of time-worn steps. The darkness below was total, almost oppressive, and the air was heavy and stale, as if it hadn't been breathed for centuries. He lit his lamp, revealing a crypt of sinister beauty. Stone statues of monks, carved in morbid detail, stood all around the room. They seemed frozen in prayer, but their faces bore expressions of suffering, as if they had been captured in a moment of eternal terror. In the center of the crypt, a massive altar stood, and just behind it, a door engraved with strange, incomprehensible symbols. The sealed door, the one the legend spoke of. Pierre approached, his breath short, his hands trembling. He knew he should never have come here, but curiosity had always been his weakness. Without thinking, he placed his hand on one of the engravings, and a thud echoed throughout the crypt as if an ancient mechanism had just been activated. The floor vibrated slightly, and a dull creak came from the walls. The statues of monks seemed to move, their heads turned towards Pierre. He took a step back, his heart beating wildly. This couldn't be happening. But when one of the nearest statues slowly opened its eyes, Pierre felt horror overwhelm him. "You shouldn't have been here." The voice, cavernous, seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The statues were moving clearly now, their faces frozen in an expression of despair, their stone bodies twisted by an invisible force. "We are the Watchers, and you have awoken what we were meant to protect." Pierre tried to step back, but his legs were as if paralyzed. An oppressive, malevolent energy emanated from the door behind the altar, and the statues of monks approached slowly, their faces riddled with cracks, as if they were breaking under the strain. "The door must never open," moaned one of the statues, his voice cracking like marble. A deafening creak echoed throughout the crypt. The door slowly began to open, releasing a breath of foul air that made the flame of Pierre's lamp flicker. An absolute, living darkness spread across the room. Pierre tried to run, but something held him back, like invisible hands gripping his legs. The statues drew closer, their faces distorted by terror. Then, suddenly, the door opened wide, and a colossal shadow emerged, an ancient, formless entity made of darkness and chaos advanced slowly, swallowing the light. The Watchers collapsed under its invisible weight, and Pierre felt an icy coldness envelop him. His last thought was that he should never have sought the truth. And in the pitch black of the crypt, the door closed behind him, sealing his fate with that of the damned who had sworn to watch over the cataclysm forever. The wind howled through the trees of the old countryside, turning every shadow into a silent threat. The night was pitch black, pierced only by the flickering light of a solitary street lamp at the entrance to the small village of Montfaucon. The inhabitants had shut themselves away in their homes, as they had done every night for weeks. Something strange, something inexplicable was lurking in the village, and that evening, that something was about to manifest itself in a terrifying way. It all began a month ago, when little Damian, a local child, disappeared without trace. The search was fruitless and the whispers grew louder. Some said he had got lost in the forest and would never come back. Others, more superstitious, spoke of a curse hanging over the village, something dark and ancient. Then, one night, he reappeared, without a word, without an explanation, holding in his small hands a rosary blackened by time, worn, as if it had survived the ages. Damian hadn't spoken since. His parents, consumed with anguish, had tried to understand him, but he remained mute, his eyes riveted on the rosary. What was most disturbing was the aura that had surrounded him since his return. The child was no longer the same. The village animals moved away from him, the dogs barked at him, and a feeling of unease grew around his presence. Every night, the church bells seemed to ring more loudly, as if they were a warning to those who knew how to listen. That evening, rumor had it that Damian had gone out again. His parents, in a panic, had asked for help from Father Andre, the village priest, a pious man tormented by deep-seated doubts. He knew that something terrible was happening here. The rosary that the child clutched between his fingers was no ordinary object. He had seen it with his own eyes, and what he had felt in its presence had haunted him ever since. He had the impression that this rosary harbored something, a force that fed off Damian, an ancient force. Father Andre rushed out of the presbytery, lamp in hand, tracking the little boy through the deserted village. He knew he had to find the child before the night became too deep. But in the darkness, every street corner seemed to harbor shadows ready to engulf him. At last, he reached the village square, where a frail figure stood motionless under the old lamppost. Damian was there, standing alone, the black rosary hanging from his pale fingers. His gaze was blank, fixed on something the priest couldn't see. Father Andre approached slowly, his stomach in knots with a fear he couldn't explain. The rosary seemed to glow with a strange, almost imperceptible light, as if the darkness were wrapped around it. "Damian," he murmured in a trembling voice, "what are you doing here? It's late. Come on, let's go home." The child did not move, his lips murmuring inaudible words like a forgotten prayer. Then, without looking up, he spoke at last. His voice was hoarse like an old man's, devoid of all innocence. "They are coming. For me. For us." The priest felt an icy shiver run up his spine. Before he could reply, the wind suddenly picked up, howling through the village, and with it came murmurs. Voices, faint at first, but growing, rising around him, a ghostly chorus that seemed to come from all sides. "Damian, leave that rosary alone, it's not yours," ordered the priest, his voice breaking with the intensity of his fear. But the child clutched the object even tighter, his dark eyes finally rising to meet those of the priest. It was no longer the look of a child. There was a terrible, evil wisdom in those pupils, something much older than him, much more dangerous. "He's theirs now," Damian murmured and smiled. The ground beneath their feet shook slightly, and Father Andre stepped back in panic. The shadows around them twisted, taking shape, transforming into blurred humanoid silhouettes as if emerging from the very depths of the night. The priest held up his crucifix, reciting prayers in a desperate effort to repel these entities. But the figures continued to advance. The rosary in Damian's hands shone with an unhealthy light, and the shadows seemed to feed off it, growing with each passing second, enveloping the village square in an impenetrable veil. Father Andre cried out, imploring God, but his prayers were lost in the wind. Damian raised his rosary above his head, and with a final burst of light, the shadows fell on the priest, drowning out his cries. The whole village was plunged into a deathly silence, as if time itself had stood still. When the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, there was no trace of Damian or Father Andre. The village was silent, but the black rosary reappeared, hanging from the church door, and anyone who dared go near it could still hear the murmurings of the shadows. The old chapel of the Holy Trinity stood at the top of a steep hill, its stone walls gnawed by time, its stained glass windows long since shattered. Abandoned for decades, it attracted less and less attention from the inhabitants of the neighboring village. Yet some said that the chapel was never really empty. Rumors circulated, stories of strange apparitions and forbidden rituals performed in the shadows. But what made this place so terrifying was an anomaly that no one could explain. All the crosses inside were turned upside down. In the village, a dull fear had set in, but nobody dared to talk about it. Those who passed by the chapel said they felt the freezing cold even in the middle of summer, or heard muffled whispers like prayers recited in a low voice, but in an incomprehensible language. Some had seen shadows moving behind the broken windows, but none had had the courage to enter. Until that evening, Elodie, a young archaeologist with a passion for religious mysteries, was determined to discover the chapel's secret. After hearing the frightening tales of the villagers, she had felt a strange fascination for the place. She wanted to understand why all the crosses were upside down. Who could have carried out such a blasphemous act, and above all, why no one dared to talk about it openly. The moon was full when she finally reached the hill, her rucksack full of research equipment and a torch in hand. The path was steep, overgrown with brambles and wild vegetation that seemed to want to keep the place under its protection. The closer she got, the more an oppressive feeling came over her, as if she were walking on sacrilegious ground. When she reached the large, solid wooden door, she hesitated for a moment. An overwhelming silence reigned around her. Not a breath of wind, not a sound of nature, oh, nothing. A terrifying emptiness that seemed to anticipate something. Elodie took a deep breath and pushed open the door, which swung open with a mournful creak. The interior of the chapel was far worse than she had imagined. The walls were stained red, ancient drips, dried, but undeniably blood. The pews were overturned, broken, as if something had been unleashed here. And in the center, where the altar should have been, sat a large wooden cross, completely inverted. Elodie approached cautiously, her heart beating wildly in her chest. There was something deeply disturbing about this cross. The more she looked at it, the more she felt a presence, as if she were being watched. But she was alone, or so she thought. She knelt down to examine the base of the cross. looking for clues. And that's when she heard it. A whisper, faint but present. She raised her head sharply, torch pointed at the shadows. There was nothing there. But the whisper continued, insidious, creeping into her mind. They're here. They never left this place. Elodie jumped to her feet, her breath coming in short gasps. The voice wasn't hers. She looked around, but no one was there. Panic was beginning to set in. Maybe the villagers were right. Maybe something evil still inhabited this place. The crosses, all inverted, seemed to stare back at her, twisting under the beam of her lamp like human figures caught in eternal suffering. An icy shiver ran down her spine, and she backed away slowly, only for the sound of footsteps to echo behind her. She turned violently, but there was no one there. Yet the footsteps came closer, as if an invisible procession were marching towards her. Whispers grew louder, prayers, but in reverse, as if they were being recited backwards in a perverted, heretical language. Elodie's lamp trembled in her hand as she scanned the room. The crosses seemed to twist and move slowly in the darkness. Their shadows grew, distorting and transforming into grotesque figures, hooded silhouettes whose faces were nothing but gaping voids. Suddenly, one of the crosses fell to the ground with a deafening crash. Elodie screamed in terror and ran towards the exit, but the door slammed shut in front of her as if prevented by some invisible force. She turned, her back against the cold wood, and the silhouettes drew closer. Their murmur had turned into a low, mournful song, echoing against the walls. They made him come. She backed away again, but there was no escape. The hooded figures now surrounded the altar, their forms stretching out in jerky movements. Their empty faces, turned towards her, reflected nothing human. The air had become unbreathable, heavy with suffering and curse. An icy, invisible hand grasped at her arm. She screamed, but no sound came from her throat. The funeral chorus continued relentless. The shadows took hold of here and everything went black. The next day, the villagers found the chapel open. Inside, they discovered a scene that terrified them to the core. Elodie's body, frozen in prayer, was nailed to an inverted cross. From that day on, no one dared go near the chapel of the Holy Trinity, because some secrets are not meant to be discovered. The church of Saint Eustache, nestling in the heart of a small, isolated valley, had been closed to the faithful for years. The villagers had deserted it, leaving the building to rot. Rumor had it that something evil had taken root there. Prayers no longer echoed beneath its vaults. Instead, profane rituals and black masses were held every night, attracting beings who dared not be named. The whole village lived in fear of what went on behind those stone walls. That evening, a flickering light danced through the broken stained glass windows of the church. The moon, high in the sky, bathed the village in a pale glow, but no one dared go out. Everyone knew the rule: never go near Saint Eustache at night. However, Etienne, a former priest who had fallen from grace, had decided to defy this rule. Devoured by the guilt of having failed to save his church from the dark forces that had invaded it, he vowed to find out what was going on there. Armed with a simple crucifix and an old missal, he approached the large wooden door. With every step he felt the oppressive presence of the evil that inhabited the place. The villagers spoke of diabolical rituals, of priests who no longer worshipped God, but something much darker. Etienne had never believed these stories. At least, he didn't want to believe them. But now that he was here, standing in front of these silent doors, fear knotted his stomach. He put his hand on the cold wood and pushed. The door opened with a sinister creak. The interior of the church was plunged into icy darkness, barely disturbed by a few candles arranged in a circle around the altar. Their flames flickered, casting misshapen shadows on the walls. Etienne moved forward, his heart beating wildly. The pews, once lined up for the faithful, were now overturned and broken. Strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like blood, covered the floor of the nave. A nauseating smell of sulfur wafted through the air, stinging Stephen's nostrils. He slowly approached the altar. Suddenly he heard murmurs, deep voices, whispering incantations in an unknown language. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, seeping into his mind like cold blades. Etienne signed himself mechanically, but he knew it would have no effect here. This place had been desecrated beyond redemption. Behind the altar, a figure emerged from the shadows. A hooded figure in a black robe stood there, its hands raised to the sky as if it were praying, or invoking something. Etienne felt a wave of terror sweep over him. This was no ordinary priest. He knew that. There was nothing sacred about what he was seeing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to recite a litany in an ancient guttural language. Etienne tried to step forward, brandishing his crucifix, but an invisible force pinned him in place. He could hardly breathe, as if the air itself were rebelling against him. "You shouldn't be here, priest," whispered the figure at last, his voice echoing deep and malevolent. "This place belongs to other forces, those you disowned long ago." Etienne wanted to reply, but the words stuck in his throat. Suddenly, an icy, inhuman laugh echoed throughout the church. He turned, looking for the source of the noise, but what he saw froze him with terror. Shadows, distorted, grotesque, detached themselves from the walls. They moved slowly, their shapeless bodies twisted into impossible angles. Their eyes, black cavities, seemed to stare hungrily at Etienne. They advanced silently, gliding across the ground like snakes in mist. "You thought you could save this place, didn't you?" continued the voice of the figure. "But it's not Saint Eustache we're looking for. We're looking for you." Etienne tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't respond. The shadows approached, their presence suffocating, burning, as if they were absorbing the light itself. He raised his crucifix, but the hooded figure laughed. "Do you think that symbol still has power here? You're just a madman, priest. A madman who has forgotten that certain forces cannot be banished by simple prayers." A particularly massive shadow approached him, stretching a skeletal hand towards his face. As it touched him, Etienne felt a stabbing pain run through his mind, as if his very soul was being torn to pieces. He screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. The hooded figure stepped forward, revealing a face distorted by malice, unspeakable horror etched into every line. "We have always been here. We are the Black Masses, and tonight, priest, you will join our cult. You will serve those you have denied." In a last effort, Etienne tried to recite a prayer, but the shadows engulfed him before he could utter a single word. Silence fell again, broken only by the murmur of candles still flickering around the desecrated altar. The church of Saint Eustache, devoured by darkness, regained its eerie calm. The shadows had taken what they wanted, and the village below would never again see its former priest. The monastery of Saint-Jacques stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, a 1,000-year-old building with a heavy atmosphere, isolated from everything. For centuries, its doors had been sealed off limits to all. Legend had it that behind these walls, something terrifying was locked away, a force so ancient that it defied human comprehension. The gates, engraved with religious symbols, bore a warning carved in stone. Whoever opens these gates will suffer eternal judgment. A light rain fell that evening, covering the monastery in a misty veil. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their crashes echoing like a funeral dirge. None of the villagers dared approach the site, but something strange had happened recently. The doors, sealed for centuries, were ajar. This is what attracted Thomas, a curious historian with a passion for religious mysteries. For years he had been searching for answers about what the monastery of Saint-Jacques was hiding, and now, at last, he had the chance to find out. Despite the warnings, despite the dark legends surrounding the place, he was determined to enter. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door, an icy breeze blew into the entrance hall, kicking up the dust that had accumulated over the centuries. The interior was plunged into almost total darkness, broken only by a few ancient candles that seemed to have been burning for eons, as if they had never been extinguished. The air was heavy, charged with an oppressive, almost tangible energy. Every step echoed strangely as if the ground absorbed the sound. Thomas advanced cautiously, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The silence was so deep it was suffocating. The walls, covered in ancient frescoes, seemed to depict scenes of the Last Judgment, tormented souls writhing under the weight of their damnation. A dull anguish began to rise within him, but his curiosity drove him to go further. At the center of the monastery was a huge circular hall, with massive stone doors lined up around it, each marked with a different symbol. Thomas counted 9 doors. Each one seemed identical, and yet he sensed that they were much more than just entrances. A whisper, barely audible, echoed in the air, like a distant melody. He approached one of the doors, the one with the symbol of a balance carved into the stone. The murmurs grew louder and louder, but he couldn't make out the words. The door was cold to the touch, almost icy. He hesitated for a moment before pushing, but something in his head told him he shouldn't have been there. Nevertheless, he continued. The door opened slowly with a dull creak, revealing a totally dark room. A faint, almost imperceptible light began to glow at the back of the room, attracting Thomas like a moth. He entered, his heart beating wildly. Inside, he discovered a huge statue, an angel, or rather what looked like an angel, but whose features were distorted by an expression of absolute terror. Its wings, black and broken, folded around its mutilated body, and its face, frozen in a grimace of anguish, seemed to stare back at him. Then the doors slammed shut behind him. Thomas's heart raced. He rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it didn't budge. The murmur in the air turned into distinct whispers, low, mocking voices closing in on him. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate slightly, and a feeling of infinite fall washed over him. He was no longer alone. You have passed through the door, human. You now stand before judgment. Thomas turned round abruptly. The statue had changed. Its eyes, once empty, were now animated by a red, malevolent gleam. It moved slowly forward, its mutilated wings dragging on the ground. "Every door leads to a judgment," continued the deep, distorted voice. "You've chosen yours. It's too late to turn back." Terrified, Thomas stepped back, but the room seemed to be closing in on him. The walls were closing in, and the air became unbreathable. He could hear screams now, groans of suffering, coming from the depths of the earth. The frescoes on the walls began to twist and move, as if the painted souls were coming to life, fighting to escape eternal condemnation. The statue was almost on top of him, its face contorted with pain, as if it were condemned to inflict the same torment it had endured. Thomas felt an icy hand grip his arm, and a searing pain shot through his body. His muscles tensed. His bones seemed to buckle under an invisible pressure. He fell to his knees, screaming, but no sound came from his mouth. "Your soul has been weighed and found guilty." In a final vision of terror, Thomas realized that each door led to a fate worse than death, an eternal judgment from which he could never escape. The statue bent over him, and with one last icy breath, he was swallowed up by the darkness. Silence fell over the monastery of Saint-Jacques, and the gates of judgment remained closed, patiently awaiting their next victim. Shadows stretched long across the walls of a small, forgotten museum, tucked away in a sleepy town. That evening, a strange exhibition had been discreetly inaugurated. Sacred objects from abandoned churches, relics covered in dust and forgotten secrets. Among them, one particularly mysterious piece had attracted the attention of a few curious onlookers. A rare artifact, a relic supposedly linked to a fallen angel, a fragment of wing, blackened with icy feathers and strangely intact, locked in a reinforced steel display case. The few visitors who came close to this relic all described the same sensation, a biting cold, as if the shadow itself were clinging to their souls. The most superstitious whispered that it was cursed, that it bore the wrath of a celestial being banished from the heavens. But these stories didn't frighten Alex, who has a passion for ancient myths and occult objects. For him, the relic was simply a fascinating curiosity, a rare piece that deserved to be studied more closely. That night, when the museum had closed its doors, Alex had managed to stay inside, thanks to a little arrangement with the caretaker. He wanted to examine the relic without the distractions of visitors. The exhibition room was plunged into almost total darkness, lit only by the dim light of his torch. The relic of the fallen angel stood in the center of the room, isolated on its stone base. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but when Alex approached it, he immediately felt what everyone was talking about. A cold shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't a natural sensation. It was as if the air itself was twisting around the relic, condensing into an invisible mist. He examined the display case, looking for inscriptions, for details, and then he saw them. Tiny runes etched into the glass. almost imperceptible to the naked eye. Ancient symbols he didn't recognize. His curiosity was piqued. Why seal a simple relic with such charms? Without thinking, he placed his hand on the glass. Instantly, a wave of cold spread across his palm, up his arm, taking hold of his body. He tried to pull his hand away, but it seemed to be stuck to the glass, sucked away by some invisible force. An icy breath escaped from the relic, and a sinister crack sounded. The glass began to crack slowly, then faster and faster, as if something from inside was trying to get out. "No," murmured Alex, desperately trying to free himself. The glass exploded into a myriad of fragments. The relic, freed from its prison, rose slightly into the air, bathing the room in a black, pulsating glow. Alex stepped back hastily, but the cold enveloped him like an icy mist. The black light emanating from the fallen wing cast moving shadows on the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. "Freed, at last." The voice was not human. It echoed through the room like something from another world, deep and menacing. Alex felt a primal terror come over him. This wasn't just a relic. It had triggered something far more powerful, far more ancient. Suddenly, the shadows on the walls stood out, taking shape. Indistinct silhouettes, winged but twisted, mutilated, their faces distorted by eternal pain. They floated around the relic, worshipping it like an evil totem. Their murmurs intermingled in a dark litany, incomprehensible, but heavy with curses. Alex tried to flee, but with every step he took, the shadows drew closer, tightening their circle around him. Their spectral hands reached out towards him, and when they touched him, a searing pain shot through his body. It wasn't physical pain. It was his spirit, his soul being torn apart piece by piece under the weight of their presence. The voice rang out again, this time louder, clearer. "You have broken the seals, human. You freed the one who was never to see the light again." Alex fell to his knees, his body shaking with spasms. The winged figures whirled around him, their horrified faces twisted in unbearable pain. They seemed to suck the very heat out of the room, plunging everything into an icy, deadly cold. "They condemned me," continued the voice. "Their God rejected me. But you gave me back my freedom now. You will be my offering." An invisible force lifted Alex from the ground. His body stiffened, his heart beating wildly. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The relic, that black, cursed wing, pulsed one last time, projecting a wave of energy that cut through Alex like a blade of ice. In a final burst of black light, all was extinguished. The next morning, when the guard opened the museum doors, he found the exhibition room empty, as if nothing had ever happened there. The relic display case was intact, and the wing of the fallen angel lay peacefully inside. But Alex had disappeared, and there was a chill in the air, like a silent warning to anyone who dared approach the cursed relic again. For certain secrets, once liberated, could never be locked away again. You've listened, you've dared to stay until the end. But perhaps you still don't understand. Are these stories mere tales to distract you? Or are they truths you should never have heard? I'll leave you with this doubt. It's best not to try and find out too much. Some secrets don't close well. The night is far from over. Where you go now? You may take something with you, or someone. Be careful as you leave this place, for you are no longer alone. You never were, in fact. May your sleep be deep, very deep. And if you survive your dreams, perhaps I will see you again. Another night, if you make it back. Goodbye for now.